We're on the lookout for sponsors to join us on our incredible journey with Inspired Change with Gunter. If your organisation cares deeply about meaningful conversations around masculinity, self-development and mental health, we'd love to partner with you. Our podcast has a wonderful, dedicated audience committed to personal growth and positive social change. By sponsoring Inspired Change with Gunter, your brand will connect with listeners who truly value thoughtful discussion and support initiatives that promote real transformation. We're incredibly proud to be ranked number 1 in Australia and number 5 in the USA on FeedSpot's top men's mental health podcasts. For more information on how to become a sponsor, please reach out to Miranda Spiegner Sapon, our showrunner and executive producer. We'd love to explore how we can work together to inspire change. Now, thank you for your continued support, and let's keep inspiring change together.
You're listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. To guide us through the intricacies and intersections of emotions, relationships, and male identity is renowned psychologist, author, and speaker Gunter Swoboda. This is Inspire Change.
Before I begin the actual podcast, I would like to respectfully acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I work. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders past and present. Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspire Change with Gunter. Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspire Change with Gunter. That's me, I'm your host. And before we get into anything, let me just stress that what I talk about in the podcast are my views, and they're my views only, and the content is basically for educational and informational purposes only. And having said that, I'm seriously glad that you're here with me. In the literature, there's often a quote that gets thrown around, especially in the media and so on. And the phrase is that the mortality gap is not a mystery. What it means is this: we know why men die earlier than women. We know the preventable causes. We know the data. We have the interventions, and in most cases, we have the services. The problem isn't knowledge. The problem is that men don't use them. So why am I talking about this? Well, because the reality is that when it comes to looking after men's health, each individual male is somewhat different, obviously, to everybody else. But the pattern across the board is that fundamentally we sort of still avoid going to the doctor. So today I want to look at that problem directly, even though I've done some other podcasts around it. You know, the question is, why do men delay, deny, and disengage from healthcare at rates that, when you look at the actual numbers, can only be described as a crisis? What's the psychological mechanism behind the health-seeking gap? And this is the part of this episode I'm most looking forward to. I want to take on a concept that's routinely used to explain male health avoidance and argue that it is being fundamentally misunderstood. And that concept is stoicism. Now, why? Because I think the way that we talk about stoicism in this context, particularly in popular discussions on masculinity, is not just imprecise, it's getting the argument almost exactly backwards. And if we can get this distinction right, it opens up something genuinely useful. So, as always, let's start with the numbers. The Australian Health Institute, the AIHW, short for the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, publishes some of the most comprehensive data on men's health in the world. Yes, the world. And the picture it paints isn't subtle. Australian men die on average approximately 4 years earlier than women. Used to be 7, so we're kicking some goals, but not enough. That gap is not driven primarily by biological sex differences. It's driven actually by behaviour, specifically by the pattern of delayed or absent health seeking that runs through virtually every domain of male health. Men visit general practitioners significantly less often than women across all age groups. They are less likely to attend preventative health checks. They are more likely to present to emergency department with conditions that, had they sought earlier care, would not have required emergency treatment. Cancer is a particularly prevalent example in this, which, along with cardiovascular disease, is the leading cause of male mortality in Australia. Men are disproportionately diagnosed at later stages, when treatment is less effective and prognosis is worse. Stage at diagnosis is not primarily a biological variable. It is a healthcare engagement variable. Now, I've seen this over 40 years in my practice. I can give you numerous examples of where, before I engaged in treating someone psychologically, I actually needed to convince them to go and get a physical. Now, let's move on to the mental health data, which is, if anything, more confronting. Beyond Blue and the AIHW both report that men are significantly less likely than women to seek professional mental health support. Now, we've talked about this quite a bit. Men account for approximately 75% of deaths by suicide in Australia. Remember, this statistic keeps coming up. It's a figure that has remained stubbornly persistent over decades, despite huge amounts of investment in suicide prevention infrastructure. The Movember Foundation, which funds men's health research globally and draws substantially on Australian data, has consistently identified help-seeking reluctance as the single most modifiable variable in the male mental health mortality equation, and it is the most resistant to change. That phrase is worth sitting with. The single most modifiable variable. Not biology, not the nature of the illness men experience, not the availability of services. The variable that would save most lives, if it changed, is whether men ask for help when they need it. Now, there is a caveat in this. For some people that I know specifically with specific types of cancer, for example, prostate cancer, some of them had no symptoms. How they got picked up was simply going to the doctor, and the doctor's gone, oh, let's do an overall check. And sure enough, there it was. So men overall, okay, the data tells us that we haven't really changed that particular variable, that behavioural variable. So the question is, why not? The standard answer is because men are socialised to be stoic, to push through, to not complain, to handle things themselves. Now, importantly, that answer is not wrong, exactly. But it's imprecise in a way that actually matters, in my view. Because the word stoic is doing a lot of work in that sentence, and most of it is the wrong kind of work. So let me be direct about something that I think is genuinely important. The stoicism that makes men avoid doctors is not stoicism with a capital S. It is not the philosophical tradition of Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, and Seneca. It is something quite different. Now, I'm going to call it patriarchal pseudo-stoicism. And conflating the two does real intellectual and practical damage. Now, here's why that distinction matters. Philosophical Stoicism, the ancient tradition, is built on a single foundational principle, the dichotomy of control. Epictetus states it plainly at the opening Enchiridion. Some things are within our power and some things are not. What is within our power? Well, it's our judgments, our responses, our values. And what isn't? Well, here's the clanger: our bodies, our reputations, external events. When I was diagnosed with a tumour, there was an element where I sort of felt betrayed by my body. How the fuck can you do this to me? Now, it didn't last very long because I do pursue, in addition to Zen, the philosophical Stoicism. And I understand that what is going on with my body is not necessarily in my control. There are lifestyle issues that I can contribute, but whether you get a disease like cancer or whether you have a disease like diabetes 1, these things represent stuff that's outside of your control. There are some shades of grey, but let's stick to the more absolute form of that. So let's read that again. Our bodies are not within our power. The Stoic tradition is explicit. A symptom, an illness, a physical vulnerability, these are not failures of will. Now, in some cases, that could be a failure of lifestyle behaviour, but generally speaking, once we got it, it's not a failure of will. They are simply facts about the world, facts that, precisely because they are not within our power, call for rational action in response. If I have a chest pain, I cannot reason the chest pain away. Positive thinking will not do that. Nor will, exercises in gratitude, avoidance, whatever it is. Mentally, I can't get rid of it. What is within my power then? All right? Think about it. What is within my power? Well, it's help seeking. It's seeking treatment, which happens to be and include seeing a professional for that issue. If I have a chest pain, I'm going to check in with my GP. If he's concerned, I'm going to see a cardiologist. As I said, there are some things where we don't get a symptom and we get caught badly by surprise. We go on. What is within my power then is dealing with the reality as it is rather than as I would prefer it to be. That fundamentally is the Stoic argument. It is not an argument for avoiding healthcare. It is the foundation of an argument for seeking it. But the Stoicism that operates in men's health avoidance works in exactly the opposite way. It treats the body as something that should be subject to will. And this is why we have serious problems around issues like body image, metabolic syndrome. Again, there are elements of behaviors in that, but generally speaking, at a certain point, it's outside of your control. It also treats the acknowledgement of physical vulnerability as a failure of masculine strength. It demands a performance of invulnerability. The man who doesn't need treatment, who pushes through, who is above the bodily weaknesses that lesser people succumb to. We are above it. Hierarchical argument, remember what we talked about. This is not a philosophical position, by the way. This is magical thinking. It is the belief you can will reality out of existence by refusing to name it. Psychology, we talk about, repression, suppression, avoidance. And the Stoic philosophers like Marcus Aurelius, who catalogued his own illnesses with unflinching precision, Seneca, who wrote with extraordinary candour about aging and mortality. Epictetus, who was a lame slave who never let his circumstances distort his judgment, would not recognise it. There is a second and even deeper distinction. Genuine Stoicism requires self-examination, reflection. It requires knowing your own inner state with precision. Marcus Aurelius' meditations are, at the core, a journal, a practice of daily inner auditing. What am I actually feeling? Is my judgment distorted right now? What is fear doing to my reasoning? Epictetus is explicit. You cannot apply reason to an emotional state you cannot identify. The whole project of Stoic practice assumes that you are continuously attending to your own inner life. Now, there is a point where we can transcend that and just be, but right now let's stay with Stoicism. Now, compare that to what patriarchal pseudo-Stoicism requires. It requires precisely the opposite. That you do not attend to your inner life, that you suppress before identification, and some people get really good and repress it, that you maintain a surface of invulnerability so seamlessly that even you do not have access to what is happening inside. This is not a difference of degree. It is a categorical reversal. There's a further distinction, I think that's the clinching one. Genuine Stoicism is a practice of individual philosophical self-cultivation. Its whole point is freedom from the opinions of others. The Stoic philosopher does not care what others think of his composure. Composure is something that he cultivates for his own rational life, not for an audience. Epictetus explicitly teaches the abandonment of concern for social evaluation. Patriarchal pseudo-Stoicism, on the other hand, depends entirely on an audience. It is a performance. It requires that others see your invulnerability. A man practicing patriarchal pseudo-Stoicism alone with no one watching is not being stoic. He's simply suppressing. The whole mechanism is organised around social comparison and status maintenance, which are precisely what Stoic philosophy identifies as the primary sources of psychological disturbance. Right? Think about this. So when we say that men's health avoidance is driven by Stoicism, we are, if we mean the philosophical tradition, getting the argument backwards. Genuine Stoicism supports help-seeking. Genuine Stoicism supports honest engagement with bodily reality. Genuine Stoicism requires a self-knowledge that health avoidance systemically destroys. Now, I've got lots of examples, especially around aging. This is a really curious one. The number of men, and my practice is embedded with a bunch of chiropractors, really interesting. It's very useful, in fact. And the number of men that I see coming in and out, and when I talk to the chiropractors about what was going on, for a lot of aging men, their injuries are a result of ignoring what their body's telling them and ignoring what's age appropriate. So they injure themselves. So then they need to recover, and that erodes them further. It raises cortisol levels, and they actually will, as a result, if that happens too often, age more quickly. So what we actually mean when we trace the health-seeking gap back to its psychological roots is that it is driven by the masculine introject, by the internalized demands of patriarchal masculinity, and that one of the things that masculine introject does is borrow the language and prestige of philosophical Stoicism while reversing its actual content. It takes the word equanimity and uses it to mean suppression. It takes the word self-control and uses it to mean self-concealment. It gives shame the disguise of philosophy. That disguise is worth removing. In fact, my argument is we must remove it, because once you see it clearly, it becomes possible to say something that men can actually work with. The Stoics would go to the doctor. The Stoics were not afraid of what was real. Age is real. I can attest to that. Look at the colour of my beard. The Stoics understood that facing reality as it is, including a body that will and can be ill, a mind that can be distressed, a body and sometimes a mind that ages, is not weakness. It is the foundation of a rational life. So let me now look at the specific psychological mechanisms that produce the health-seeking gap. Because, as I said, men are socialized not to seek help. Now, this is a description, not an explanation. To change behavior, we need to understand the mechanism. Now, the first mechanism is what the research literature calls normalization of symptoms. Men, significantly more than women, tend to interpret symptoms, pain, fatigue, changes in mood, or cognition, changes in the body, as either normal variations or as something that will resolve on its own with sufficient willpower. Now, this is not stupidity. It's a cognitive pattern shaped by the masculine introject's fundamental demand, self-sufficiency. If I define my worth partly through not needing assistance, then naming a symptom that might require assistance, that is a threat to that worth. So the symptom gets reclassified. It becomes nothing. It becomes, oh, everyone gets this. It becomes, oh, I'm just tired. The reclassification is not consciously strategic. It happens below the level of deliberate thought. But it is nonetheless a defense against the psychological cost of acknowledging need. Right? So remember, as much as the Stoics talk about that conscious reflection, the rational, they also acknowledge that self-awareness, self-reflection is about understanding what's at deeper levels of our being. Now, the second mechanism is anticipatory shame about the clinical encounter itself. Research consistently shows that men are not simply indifferent to healthcare. They are, in many cases, actively anxious about it. They anticipate the consultation as a moment of exposure, of being assessed, found inadequate, told that something is wrong with them, or in the mental health context, labelled as mentally ill. Now, I'll give you a physical example. One of the things that a lot of men shy away from is anything to do with their genitals or with their rectum. Okay? You can watch guys, the moment you bring that up, flinch, right? With the mental health arena, it's right across the board. So it could be anxiety, it could be depression, it could be trauma related. The idea that my childhood has no impact at all on my adult being and my depression is a common thing that I hear. Or I don't want to go back into my child. That's usually when I know that we're on the right track, because they're defensive about it. So that whole process is fundamentally really important to understand. For a man whose sense of worth is organised around competence and self-sufficiency, the clinical encounter is structurally threatening. The doctor is someone who sees things you've been hiding from yourself. Things like, you drink too much, so when your doctor asks you, so how much are you drinking? And you go, a bit socially. Well, define socially, a glass or two with dinner, when in fact you're drinking a bottle of half a red. This is not a comfortable experience for men. And so, in many cases, it does not happen. Right? And so if I come back to the issue about depression, which has been neatly captured into the mythology of that depression is a result of an imbalance in serotonin or neurochemicals, we stop there. We don't sort of go, well, hang on a minute, let's look at the biopsychosocial behavioural issues and ask deeper questions about what the person's doing in that regard. What are they not telling me? The third mechanism is what I think of as the language problem. Many men, as we've discussed in previous episodes, have significant alexithymic tendencies. Without identifying and articulating emotional and somatic experiences, we have a grey area. When a GP asks, "How are you feeling?" a man who has spent 30 years not attending to his inner life often genuinely does not know. He does not have reliable access to his own distress. He cannot give the doctor the information the doctor needs, so the consultation produces very little, and he doesn't go back, and the pattern reinforces itself. Now, if you've got questions about this, remember that how we conceptualize this actually leads to what sort of treatments do we then produce for the patient or the client. So the fourth mechanism, and this is the one particularly visible in mental health avoidance, is the threat to identity. For many men, acknowledging depression, anxiety, or significant psychological distress involves confronting a self-concept built around control and emotional stability. To say, I have depression or I'm not coping is within the masculine introject's logic to say I've failed at being a man. The diagnosis is not experienced as information about a treatable condition. It's experienced as a verdict on the person. It's a moral failure. So no wonder men avoid it. Now, none of these mechanisms are inevitable. They are all products of specific formation processes that can be understood and changed. But it is important to note that they operate differently at different points in the health-seeking sequence. Normalization of symptoms happens before a man even considers making an appointment. Anticipatory shame happens at the point of considering the appointment. The language problem happens inside the consultation. The identity threat happens around diagnosis and disclosure. Culturally competent male health engagement, which is what we need much more of, needs to address all four, not just one. The Movember Foundation's State of Men's Mental Health reports consistently argue for a model they can call reaching men rather than waiting for them. Active, proactive, community-embedded health outreach that meets men in the context where they already are, workplaces, sporting clubs, barbershops, rather than assuming that the clinical system as it's currently configured will attract them. This is a structural insight. The health system was not designed with male patterns of health engagement in mind. It was designed for people who present when they have symptoms and describe those symptoms with some emotional literacy. Many men don't do either. So what does change look like in this space? Now, I want to take a quick look at this at the individual level, the clinical level, and the cultural level. At the individual level, and I want to speak directly to you guys out there, you men, you blokes who are listening. I want to offer a reframe. The reason you might resist going to the doctor, dentist, psychologist, psychiatrist is not, as you may have experienced it, a sign of strength. The behavior that feels like self-sufficiency is actually a kind of epistemological failure to know what is happening inside your own body and mind, and a refusal to acquire that knowledge when it's available. The philosopher who said that an unexamined life is not worth living was making a claim about the examined inner life. The same logic applies to the examined body. To not know what is happening in you when you could know is not equanimity, it's avoidance. The genuinely stoic position is the one that I outlined earlier. Illness is not within your mental control. It's not, your will won't change it. What is within your control is what you do in response to it. So rather than a bottle and a half of Merlot with dinner, have one day on, one day off, one glass, that's it. That will help your health. But it's also going to the doctor to get a checkup to see how your liver's doing after drinking a bottle and a half of Merlot for the last 5 years. So seeking treatment is the rational exercise of agency over what can be changed. Refusing to seek treatment because it would damage your self-image is not the exercise of agency at all. It is the exercise of fear. Now, at the clinical level, the research is clear that male health engagement improves substantially when clinicians are trained to adapt their approach to male patterns. Now, I can tell you that from my research into how we train psychologists, especially at the universities that I've looked at, is we do not have a specific approach to gendered mental health care. We may talk about issues about that women experience, but we do not do the same or deeper with men's issues. So what does that mean specifically? There's less reliance on direct emotional inquiry at the outset of a consultation. More use of externalizing language. A lot of men in your situation find it difficult. And that reduces individual, it's designed to reduce individual shame. Framing health engagement at the clinical level. The research is clear that male health engagement improves substantially when clinicians are trained to adapt their approach to male patterns. That means specifically less reliance on direct emotional inquiry at the outset of the consultation. More use of externalizing language. A lot of men in your situation find this difficult because that reduces individual shame, right? Framing health engagement as a problem solving rather than a disclosure of vulnerability. And understanding that a man who appears reluctant or deflective in a consultation may be experiencing significant distress that his vocabulary and his defenses prevent him from expressing directly. This is not about lowering the bar of clinical rigor. It is about recognizing that effective clinical communication is calibrated to the person in front of you. If the standard consultation style reliably underserves male patients, and the data strongly suggests it does, then adapting that style is clinical competence, not special treatment. So, what about the cultural level? Well, at the cultural level, which is ultimately where the most significant change fundamentally needs to happen, the task is to separate what is genuinely valuable in the masculine tradition of self-reliance from what is pathological in the patriarchal demand for invulnerability. And here, as I argued earlier, the genuine Stoic tradition is an ally rather than an obstacle. Marcus Aurelius went to doctors. He wrote about his illnesses. He did not consider the acknowledgement of physical vulnerability a threat to his philosophical practice or his personal dignity. He understood that you cannot exercise rational agency over a reality that you are refusing to see. That is the model I want to offer, not the performance of invulnerability, not the suppression of distress until it becomes a crisis, but the kind of engaged, honest, self-examining relationship with one's own body and mind that makes early intervention possible, that keeps men in the lives of the people who need them, and that, as the AIHW data makes clear, would measurably reduce the mortality gap that currently takes Australian men 4 years before their time. The mortality gap is not a mystery, and the solution is not a mystery either. Men need to engage with healthcare the way that rational, honest, self-aware people engage with the realities that they cannot control, by naming them, by seeking the help that is available, and by refusing to let the performance of strength prevent the actual exercise of it. Because when you get ill, you're not strong. And this is where I go. The idea that we see in the media about battling illness and soldiering on, in my view, can take us into dusty territories. Yes, we need to, open ourselves up to the treatments available and move into them. Now, I can't remember this particular piece of research, but many, many, many years ago, there was some research done, and I'm going to look it up, about the fact that people with cancer diagnoses who went into a state of acceptance actually did better. And I'm going to check that out. So right now, this is not quotable. But anyway, keep that in mind. I'll come back to it. So to close, this has been Inspire Change with Gunter. I want to encourage you to visit our Patreon community for this episode's members exercise. I designed it to help you map your own inner relationship with health seeking and identify specifically where avoidance is operating in your life. And if this episode has made you think of someone, a mate, a father, a brother, who you've been watching delay care he needs, send it to him. That might be the most useful thing you do today. So until next time, stay curious, stay honest, and be reflective. On this show, we talk a lot about living with purpose, slowing down, paying attention, and being intentional about the choices we make every day. Because when we simplify the noise around us, we can better hear what really matters. Empathy, connection, and showing up as the best version of ourselves. That's why I'm genuinely pleased to welcome our newest sponsor, Distill Union. Their philosophy aligns beautifully with what we do here. Distill Union creates slick, thoughtfully designed essentials. Wallets, key organizers, phone cases, all built with a less is more approach. Their Wally wallets, Ferris key organizers, these are everyday tools that make life easier, cleaner, and calmer. In that simplicity, there's space for clarity. There's space for change. As a thank you to our Inspire Change community, they're offering 20% off any product with the promo code INSPIRECHANGE. Have a look, try them out, and see how simplifying your day can open the door to something deeper. Visit distillunion.com and enjoy 20% off any product with the promo code INSPIRECHANGE. That's distillunion.com with promo code INSPIRECHANGE to check out.
Hello to all our listeners. We thank you for tuning in and supporting positive social change, which makes you a part of Gunter's efforts in transforming not only men's lives, but lives in general. And we are grateful that you have joined us. We want to extend a huge thank you to our listeners in Kendall Park and Bloomfield for bringing New Jersey to number 9 on our top USA listeners list. And to our global listeners, A special shout out to our listeners in Zurich for launching Switzerland to number 11 on our global listeners list. Last but not least, to our listeners in Jakarta, thank you for bringing Indonesia to number 18. Congratulations for making the top listeners list. I, Devonna Prinzi, the co-executive producer, and our showrunner, Miranda Spigner-Sapone, sincerely thank you and ask that you please take the time to like, follow, subscribe, and share as your efforts make a difference to everyone here at Inspire Change with Gunter. If these stories resonate with you and you would like to engage more with Gunter and the Inspire Change team, please consider joining our Patreon community, where our members find bonus content and early access to video episodes. Membership awaits at patreon.com/Inspire Change. That's patreon.com/INSPIRECHANGE. As always, thank you to each and every one of our listeners. And most importantly, please keep inspiring positive social change.
Love to hear from you. And if you're interested, please check out my work on www.GunterSwoboda.com or www.goodmengreat.com.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. For more information on the Making Good Men Great movement, or for individual or group coaching sessions with Gunter, visit goodmengreat.com.